This is definitely a discussion all about how to talk to an audience, how to understand an audience, and how to be better communicators through the principles and fundamentals of storytelling. This is actually my first time attending the WordCamp for publishers. I've been to tons of other WordCamps around the country. I go every year to a handful. Been doing that for several years now. But because this is my first time here, I've been asking Steph nonstop, but I want to do a quick poll. I'm so curious as the different types of publishers we have with us today. Is anybody here a journalist? Okay, fewer than I thought. Bloggers. Editors. Site owners or managers. Okay, all right. Designers and or developers. Okay, great. So, am I missing anybody? Any other types of publishers that I didn't get to? Okay. That's awesome, thank you. I'm a blogger myself, as you heard in the introduction. Elegant Themes, where I work now, we publish articles on WordPress, on Divi, on design, on business, on marketing, and more. But before I began working at Elegant Themes, I had a pretty unique job that I'm not sure many people get the opportunity to pursue. I was something called a story consultant, and yes, I did make that up. Just something I thought that would be fun to do for a living, and it was great, and I hope to do that again one day. Basically what it consisted of was consulting with companies about their branding and their marketing, film and television studios or independent theaters about their scripts, authors about their books, and basically anyone who felt like they had a gray area or they could use some help with storytelling of any kind. I would take questions, do sessions. It was a really fun job. I ended up joining Elegant Themes full time because I felt like if I really wanted to learn the nitty-gritty, the ins and outs of the most effective way to use storytelling in marketing, which I saw at the time as probably the most immediate avenue for my personal success, I needed to do it day in and day out at one company so that I would have just use case after use case. That, and they had great benefits and a steady paycheck. So, you know, let's be real, like, that's a concern. But I wasn't wrong about the learning opportunities, and as a bonus, the company's pretty cool and I enjoy working there. I'm excited today to get to share with you some of the most essential lessons I've learned about storytelling and publishing over the last several years. The structure of today's talk is a little unique, and that's because one of my biggest frustrations as a consultant was that many times my clients would come to me with these preconceived ideas of what a story is, what it should be able to accomplish, and how it's supposed to be implemented into their strategy. They would go, hey, storytelling's a big buzzword right now. If so-and-so is doing it, we should be too. And a lot of times those relationships didn't go very smoothly because they fundamentally misunderstood what stories are and what their function is. So today I have a two-part talk. The first part is sort of like a crash course in storytelling theory. And the second part is how to apply that to online publishing. And by the way, if you're a note taker, I would actually recommend not taking notes. These slides will be available after the fact, but because of the amount of content I want to cover, I'm actually going to be moving pretty fast, and so some slides might just zip by. It's probably better just to listen in. Okay. So part one, what are stories? And I'm assuming that in a room full of people in publishing, we probably got a lot of good ideas about stories. Does anybody want to take a whack at what are stories? No problem. Oh, yeah.
Something that happened at the beginning and middle and an end.
Okay, yeah, heard that one. Anybody else? Yeah.
Something you remember.
Okay. Conflict, good.
Engaging.
Sorry?
Engaging.
Engaging, yeah. So these are all definitions we're probably familiar with. You know, fictional account of imaginary people, recounting of events, a memory, a rumor, a report, a lie, beginning, middle, and an end. Those all do describe stories, but if you're like me and you think about, okay, how do I apply that to my profession, my craft, they're just not as helpful as you would hope. And I found personally that if I was going to get to a truly beneficial and practical definition of stories, I had to ask a little bit of a different question. I had to ask, why do stories exist? Why do they exist in the first place? What is their function? What purpose do they serve from, say, like an evolutionary standpoint? I've never thought about that. It's a really interesting question that gets right down to the core of what it means to be a human being. And typically when I say that line, somebody in the room is probably like, I did not sign up for this deep of a talk. But I promise you, if you stay with me on this journey, you'll get something useful by the end of it, hopefully. So let's jump into it. So again, seeing as this is a room full of writers, you've probably got some familiarity with story theory or narrative theory. And there's just tons of brilliant academics out there who have made it their life or their body of work in part or in whole all about pinning down the answer to what stories are, what function they serve, and why we are so enthralled by them. I mean, you've got Carl Jung's work on symbols, archetypes, and the collective unconscious, Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, Propp's morphology of the folktale, which, if you don't know, is basically the plot to every Disney cartoon of all time. The Uses of Enchantment, which is a great little book on why magic exists as a storytelling device and what kids' psychology gets out of it. And then there's Christopher Booker's 7 Basic Plots, which we'll get into a lot today. But what's interesting about these people and just countless others are that when you begin to study their work, you start to see stories differently. You begin to see stories as essential to the way that human beings think, to the way that we order our thoughts, and the way that we filter our experiences of the world and our sense of where we fit in it. You begin to see the underlying structure and elements of stories, the things that they all have in common, regardless of how unique they might seem on the surface. And you can even start to see how these elements work together to accomplish specific goals that the storyteller has. And once you understand that, you can begin to play with those elements yourself, pulling them apart, putting them back together until you've told a story that's yours and it says exactly what you want it to say. And it should be noted, I don't want to come off as too authoritative here. Many of the writers and thinkers that I mentioned and others that have covered these types of topics, they would have you think that they've cracked the code on stories, that their theory on narrative structure and archetypes, it's the universal one and you don't have to go any further. And I would love to be able to agree. It would certainly make my presentation more authoritative. But in my experience, it's just not true. You know, I'm a far cry from a world-class academic myself or an academic at all. But just as a passionate storyteller and someone who cares about their craft, I've found errors or shortcomings in almost all of the different theories of story that I've studied. It doesn't mean that they're not worth familiarizing yourself with. It just means literary analysis and psychology are not hard sciences. You can't, you know, it's very, very difficult to pin them down. And I found that the best way to use these things, in addition to some of the tips that I'll give today, is just to learn as much as you can, soak it all up, and use these ideas as guideposts in your storytelling process, and it's going to help you gain a mastery over communication that you probably couldn't get without it, and that's the really important thing. Okay, end of disclaimer. Since it's hard to talk about something so abstract without visual aids, we're going to use some diagrams today. So this particular diagram is one that I created by combining a lot of the ideas and the different sources I had on some previous slides and a bunch that I didn't. I've also added some things in here that I found personally helpful in my storytelling practices that I didn't necessarily pick up from anybody else. And we don't have time to go over this whole thing. I'm not going to go through it point by point. Trust me, we do not have time for that. But I can give you a sort of high-level overview that will hopefully help you start to think a little bit differently about stories too. And we should be able to share a shared vocabulary about storytelling that will really help us communicate better in part 2 of the presentation. Okay, so to get started, I want to kind of get rid of all the visual noise. And I want you to imagine that this dot is a story. We're viewing it from a distance, and if we zoom in, we can begin to make out its individual components. So this is the terrain upon which the characters of a story navigate. It has a top and it has a bottom. The top half is called the ordinary world. This is the realm of normal human experience for the story's protagonist or hero. This is not a universal normal, it's just normal for them. The bottom half is called the special world. This is a realm outside of the hero's ordinary experience, outside their comfort zone, you might say. And the function of the special world is to transform the characters in important and meaningful ways as they pass through it. The line that separates these two worlds is called the threshold of adventure. If you think back to The Matrix, which I just found out was 20 years ago, and it has me feeling super sad about how old I am now, it's the red pill or the blue pill. It's the thing that you do that once you do it, you can't go back. The only way to go back is to go through. That's the threshold of adventure. Once you're there, you're there. Every story begins with a status quo. So this is a normal state of affairs that defines the ordinary world. This can be good, or it can be bad. It can be the peaceful village of the Shire in the Lord of the Rings, or it can be a city like Gotham in the DC Comics universe that's crumbling from the inside with crime and corruption. At the center of everything lies something called the world navel. This is a symbol that represents that thing in which the hero or the world needs. So if you're telling a story of redemption, it could be the source of forgiveness. If you're telling a monster slaying story, it could be the source of magic or technology that's needed to defeat it. And finally, when we cross back over the threshold of adventure on the other side of the story map, we're in a new ordinary world, one that has been made possible by the power that the transformed hero brought back. So these are the regions of our story map. So as characters progress around the map from status quo, across the threshold of adventure, into the special world, and back to the other side, we can identify the most common movements that they make and group them into stages. So stage one is called departure. In this stage, something disrupts the status quo to such an extent that our protagonist is forced to take action. This could be evil Black Riders coming from Mordor, forcing Frodo to flee the Shire. Or it could be Bruce Wayne's parents dying tragically as a result of Gotham's rampant crime, forcing him to take a journey that will transform him into Batman. In the second stage, called Trials and Revelations, the protagonist undergoes a series of tests. They make friends and enemies along the way, resulting in important revelations or lessons that further equip them to achieve their ultimate goal. So for this, I always say, think of Harry Potter. A young boy leaves the ordinary world. He goes to a magical world. He's destined to defeat the evil wizard who killed his parents, but before he can do that, he undergoes a series of trials or tests each year at school. Each of these trials and tests strengthen him and teach him lessons and acquire him friends. He also learns more about his enemies, both big and small, whether it's Malfoy at school, a classmate, or it's the big villain, Voldemort. And then we have the third stage called seizing the reward. But before we can talk about that, we have to address the dash in the middle, which now has a label called the Supreme Ordeal. When you say seizing the reward, the natural question is reward for what? And the answer is passing through the supreme ordeal. So this is what it's called when the hero of a story either literally or figuratively faces death. And this is a hard concept to kind of understand without some examples. So I have a figurative example here to start. Anybody seen the movie Devil Wears Prada? Yeah, so there's the hero of the story, Andrea, confronts the possibility that she's killing her career by finally standing up for what she believes in and quitting her job as the personal assistant to the most influential person in fashion. So her reward is she gets her dignity, her autonomy, and her personal sense of right and wrong restored. Now, she still has to go through the big final process. She's still got to figure out her work situation. She's still got to patch up broken relationships in her life. But she's faced that thing that she needed to face in order for her life to be more than just climbing up the ladder and putting money in the bank account. And then the literal example, again, I'm going with Harry Potter because I started to look at some of my other examples, and they were all 20 plus years old, and it just made me really sad. So I had to try to find something more current. So in the Battle of Hogwarts, the forces of Voldemort are winning. Harry is given the choice. You either force everyone to fight to the death, or you can surrender yourself, saving everyone else. So Harry turns himself over to be killed, and when the crucial blow is struck, he's not instantly killed. Instead, he's taken to this sort of in-between place where he has this profound realization. He had come to believe prior to that moment that he was powerful, that he was talented, that he was chosen because of character flaws that he shared with the villain. His identity was all mixed up. And it was because of this spell that had bonded him and this person that he didn't want to be like together. And it was in that moment that he realized that the source of his strength was actually his own. It was rooted in his values and his friends and his family and where he came from. And he could choose to live and let just that evil part that had bonded to him die. And that's exactly what he does. And his reward, I mean, when it's literal, the first part is they live. But then the second part is, for him, he still has to win the battle, of course, but now he knows where his strength really lies. And together with his friends and his families and his community, they can actually stand up for the values that they believe in, the ones that make the wizarding world worth living in. Which brings us to our final stage, unification. In this stage, the final confrontation happens. Voldemort's killed, the war is won. All of the loose ends are neatly tied up, and the power of the world naval is successfully used to create a new world, which will, over time, become the new status quo. Pretty simple, right? Okay, so it turns out that there's actually 7 different, extremely tried and true paths through the story map. These are known as archetypal or basic plots. So these plots are all pulled from the book I mentioned earlier called The 7 Basic Plots. Definitely recommend that you check it out if you're interested in this topic. The first one is overcoming the monster. And this is a story in which the hero is called to face and overcome a terrible and deadly personification of evil. You could think the shark in Jaws, or you could think the sociopathic bureaucrat in Inglourious Bastards, Hans Landa. Rags to riches, very popular in America. This is in which some young hero, unrecognized, is eventually lifted out of obscurity, poverty, and misery to a state of great splendor and happiness. So think Cinderella, think American Dream, and you got it. The quest, in which the hero is pulled towards some distant, all-important goal. They're often drawn into various side quests, but the story cannot conclude until they've achieved their ultimate goal. So this is extremely popular, and one of the most popular plots you get. And the best example of it in recent literature and cinema, I think, Lord of the Rings. Voyage and return. So this is a story in which the hero is abruptly transported out of their normal world into an abnormal world and eventually back to where they began, often wondering if it was all a dream and what it means. So this is Alice in Wonderland. This is Wizard of Oz. This is also a great story if you want to connect with a 20-something who left home, went to college, got all kinds of interesting experiences. This is a story in which a cloud and frustration covers a group of people, cutting them off from each other. The confusion gets worse and worse as the pressure builds, resulting in a nightmarish tangle of misunderstandings until finally something happens to dispel the cloud. Miraculously, everyone is on the same page, transforming the confusion and frustration into joyful unions. Think the end of Shrek, the movie Hitch. People are hanging out, they're getting to know each other, things are going really well, maybe romance in the air, all of a sudden a misunderstanding happens, oh my god, he's the worst man ever. Things get terrible, and all of a sudden misunderstandings are cleared up. There's a dance scene at a wedding, and credits roll. A fatal flaw results in the death of the hero. So what better example than Hamlet or Romeo and Juliet, which you'll be familiar with those from high school English. Romeo and Juliet is, I think, a particularly good example because this is an example of a story that could have, probably should have been, if you were living it, a comedy where everybody dances and there's a marriage and you're happy, but instead of that, it takes a tragic turn and you have a funeral instead of a wedding. But then finally there's rebirth, in which a hero falls under the power of a dark shadow. At first everything seems to be going well. Over time, however, they find themselves living in torment. They hit rock bottom, but instead of dying, they're reborn. So this is every musical biopic you've ever seen. Rock star rises to fame while indulging in sex and drugs. Eventually their life falls apart, they hit rock bottom, but instead of persisting in their bad behavior, they take advantage of a second chance, they find redemption, and it results in a new lease on life. So in any story that you tell, there's likely going to be one or more of these plots present. Not just tell or experience. That's why they're archetypes. I mean, they're the most common of common plots. They're so ubiquitous as to be universal. But in recognizing that, it really begins to tell you something pretty profound about about what it means to be and to communicate with other human beings. Speaking of which, we have to cover characters with it. So these are the human beings in our story. So every story has a cast of characters, and they all spring from various basic archetypes, just like the plots. And depending on who you're talking to, they might say there's potentially dozens of essential archetypal characters. And there are, but for the purposes of this presentation today, I'm only going to highlight 4 because I really want you guys to get to a part 2. So the hero archetype represents the search for identity and wholeness. So this character provides the audience with a relatable window into the story, so that when the hero experiences transformation, the audience, through their relationship to them, can also experience it in part. So there's this misconception that the hero has to be this like muscle brawn superhero, but even in superhero stories, they don't start that way. They start someone flawed, someone weak even, someone on the outside of the mentor is often the facilitator of this process. So the mentor archetype represents the highest aspirations of the story's hero. This is somebody that they might become as awesome as someday. And mentors are a lot of times just heroes who have gone before, and they're now passing on their knowledge and wisdom to the next generation. And if you're wondering about one of the most practical uses of storytelling, key to open a lock, it could be information, computer code, or my personal favorite, magic sword. Ally. So the ally archetype represents underutilized aspects of the self that need to be put into play in order to overcome the trials of the story. So the friends a hero makes are never accidental, at least from a storytelling perspective. They may, in and of themselves, possess really valuable skills and knowledge and whole personalities and all that stuff, but ultimately, as a function that they serve the purpose of helping the central hero grow in important ways. And then there's the shadow. So this is less of a single character and more of a character type. So the shadow archetype is the negative opposite of all the other archetypes. So if there's a good mother, there's also an evil witch. If there's a good wizard, there's sorrow. And what this does is it creates an equally compelling opposite. So if the mentor is the thing that the hero could potentially become, then the villain is the thing that it could also become and might fear in itself. So let's revisit the question, what are stories? First of all, congratulations, you made it through literary analysis and no one has left, so thank you. We should now have a bit of a shared vocabulary about storytelling that we can touch on moving forward. So we understand that stories can be mapped, that there are significant regions to the story map, that there are 7 primary paths through that map, and that archetypal characters represent important states of being both in the story itself and in the audience. So let's revisit this question, and hopefully we can answer it in ways that content creators, publishers, and designers and developers like you all can benefit from. So the first definition, I've got 3 of them, is that stories are a simplification of reality, usually with the aim of highlighting just the details that convey the storyteller's intended message. If you want to see how frustrating it is when a story doesn't honor this definition, just talk to any old person ever, right? Like, oh, we were doing this thing last Tuesday. Honey, was it Tuesday or Thursday? And then the details get like all jumbled up. They have way too much unnecessary stuff. You don't know what you're supposed to be focusing on, and after a while you just check out. A good story is a simplification of reality that only highlights the information that the audience cares about. The second is that it's a compact vehicle for complex ideas. So think of folk tales or fairy tales and myths. They're very simple in their characters and their structure, but they're also encodings for important lessons. Think Aesop's fables. Every story has a very specific moral or lesson. And a lot of times, just the nature of how the characters behave, they can teach you things about yourself, how you're supposed to interact with others, how you're supposed to interact with your surroundings. And on the folktale side, I particularly love reading regional folktales because they'll actually include little details that, say, you would need for like survival in that area. Like the character goes somewhere and they can eat this mushroom, but not that mushroom. I don't care 100 years later, but at the time, that wasn't just a detail they threw in there. That was actual encoded information on how to engage with your world that you live in. And that's what it's really all about. It's about navigating yourself, navigating your relationships with others, with your culture, with the world around you. And that's our last definition. Tool. They're tools of orientation. Stories are tools of orientation. Once we have a sense of ourselves, once we know how we fit into our family unit, into our tribe, into our culture, into our world, then we can live our lives without constantly having to navigate difficult existential questions all the time. I mean, if you don't know, your answer to the big questions of where we come from, why am I here, what's my purpose in life, that can be paralyzing. And a lot of stories, what they do is they help you create a sense of yourself and how you fit into everything. And then we simply plot our new experiences into the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves and about the world that we live in. So these stories collectively form a running narrative of our lives and our perception of reality. So remember that doctrine earlier that we started with? The one that if we zoom in on it, we see the story map. Well, if we zoom back out, and instead of focusing on one story, we focus on lots of stories, we can see that there's some shape there. And if we start to connect dots, that's the easiest explanation of what a narrative is. So one of those dots could just be an experience. One could be a big story. Narrative is you get this momentum, and I'm sure you all see it in the newsroom all the time. Here's this event. Oh, this is just another example of this and this and that. Well, that's a narrative building, and that's what makes it effective. Is it's slotted into something that the people who that story already means something to, they can instantly pick up on it and go, yeah, that's part of the thing that I'm already telling myself, and part of my idea about what's really going on in the world. Okay, so now let's get to part 2. Storytelling and online publishing. So I'd like to begin with just some general takeaways that I think anybody could use, but then we'll get more specific. So key takeaway number 1, the most important stories are the ones that we tell ourselves about ourselves. These stories determine our identity. They determine what we believe in on the deepest levels. And that means by extension, the most important story you can tell others is one that puts them in the lead role, either directly or through a proxy that they deeply relate to. So if you want an idea of how powerful this practice can be, just pay really close attention to the messaging coming out of the various political campaigns this year. You're going to see some really potent narratives and people in full swing of that narrative's influence on them. And then the third takeaway is you really can't tell an effective story if you don't know your audience. And I don't mean if you don't know who you're talking to. I mean if you don't know what they value, if you don't know how they identify. It's just going to be really hard to tell a story that that person cares about deeply or that influences them to take some kind of action, which of course is what we all are striving for, is content that people engage with, that matters to them, that they identify with, which is segue into some of the common misunderstandings about storytelling. Just telling a story is not enough. You can't just tell a story and sprinkle story dust on bad practices and all of a sudden you've got great content. That's not how it works. You need to be telling the right story. Does your story place your audience in the lead role, either directly or through a proxy? Does it speak to something that's valuable to them? Does it say something that they need or believe or that they think will make the world a better place? Does it fit into their larger personal narrative, or does it conflict with it? Which is not always a bad thing. You just should probably know if you're doing that. Or are you just whiffing entirely and telling a story that no one cares about and no one can relate to, which I see happening all the time. My favorite version of this is like when you're watching YouTube and an ad comes on that is like 3 to 2 minutes of an action movie, and then afterwards you're like, find out what happens on Toyota.com. And I'm like, nope, no one cares. You guys spent a lot of money on that and no one cares. So the next common misconception is a good story is not a substitute for science. You may have heard the saying, don't let a fact get in the way of a good story, and that's because it happens all the time. Let's recall our first definition of a story. A story is a simplification of reality for the purpose of highlighting just the details the storyteller needs in order to convey their message. So it's important to remember that the very act of simplification that makes storytelling an effective mode of communication also makes it kind of dangerous. By simplifying reality, we distort reality. And when we distort reality, truth doesn't always come out on the other side. So it's important to remember that stories can be used effectively to tell both truth and lies that resonate deeply with their audience. Again, pay attention to campaign messaging. You will see it all over the place. But I found the best way to counter this type of storytelling mistake or misconception is that just practice good science. If your story makes a claim, prove it with data. This will ensure that your stories, the ones that you tell yourself especially, but also the ones you tell others, don't just become delusions, that they stay anchored in reality. And another important note on science is that, when it comes to content strategy, data should come before the story. Work with your best SEO strategy you can come up with, pay attention to what your analytics are saying, and then use storycraft to push the needle in the right direction. Don't try to do it the other way around.